everyone, and welcome, bienvenue, Wadkwanue Radu, to Teach, Learn, Share, a podcast that thoughtfully explores teaching and learning practices in higher ed. I am Jasmine Parent, a learning technology consultant at Teaching and Learning Services at McGill University. I'm joined today by my co-host for this podcast series, Dr. Carolyn Samuel, the Associate Director of Faculty and Teaching Development at Teaching and Learning Services, which we commonly refer to as TLS.
Thank you, Jasmine. So we're exploring a new topic in this podcast series, which we're calling Course Design with Sustainability in Mind. And the title might make what we're going to talk about seem obvious, but there really are some important ideas to unpack, like what sustainability means in the context of course design and how one can work with a potentially overwhelming topic to bring it into the courses we teach in meaningful yet manageable ways. So in this podcast series, we're going to learn from members of the McGill community who've addressed sustainability in the context of designing or redesigning courses, what it means to design a course with sustainability in mind. And of course, they're going to share some concrete examples with us. And I think examples are incredibly useful. Sometimes it's hard to imagine how we can change our courses. We're so ensconced in our disciplines and in the way we do things. And ideas from others who've engaged in the process can really help us broaden our conception of what's possible. And I'd also like to mention that we're going to look at sustainability from a couple of different perspectives. So one perspective is to do with the facets of sustainability we'd like to teach students. But another perspective is how instructors can design or redesign courses so they're evergreen. And if listeners are not sure what evergreening is in the context of course design, it has to do with keeping a course up to date, but in ways that are sustainable given instructor workloads. And we'll say more about that and share examples in a later episode. For now, today, we'd like to meet today's guests and hear what they have to say about course design with sustainability in mind. So, Jasmine, would you introduce our guests?
Absolutely. So joining us on the podcast today to help us understand what sustainability is and what it means to have sustainability in mind when designing courses are Dr. Blane Harvey and Stephanie Leite. Dr. Harvey and Stephanie will help us build a strong foundation for the topic and help us contextualize the examples that we're going to be exploring in other episodes in this series. Dr. Harvey is an associate professor and William Dawson Scholar in the Department of Integrated Studies in Education at McGill, where he leads the Leadership and Learning for Sustainability Lab. He is an interdisciplinary scholar whose work spans the social and natural sciences on the themes of learning, collaboration, environmental change, and education for sustainable development. Dr. Harvey's research investigates how climate change knowledge is produced, validated, and communicated, and how facilitated learning and knowledge sharing can support action on climate change, especially within communities most vulnerable to its impacts. Stephanie Leite is a PhD student and Vanier Scholar at DICE. Stephanie previously served as a teacher and curriculum designer at Global Citizenship Experience Lab School in Chicago, where she was part of a team rethinking education to address the world's biggest challenges. She has a background in arts education, conflict transformation, and sustainable development, which influences her current research on transformative climate change education. Stephanie is a member of Dr. Harvey's Leadership and Learning for Sustainability Lab, which studies ways of transitioning towards more collaborative and transdisciplinary models of research and practice. Blane and Stephanie, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
So perhaps I can get the conversation going, since it will be helpful to understand what is meant by sustainability in the context of course design. Can you explain what sustainability is so that our listeners will be able to understand it in that context and perhaps help us also understand why it matters? And maybe, Blane, would you like to start?
Sure. Let me start by saying I think sustainability is a bit of a fuzzy term and there's a lot of different perspectives on what it means and what it looks like. Often when we think about sustainability and even within McGill's own sustainability strategy, we talk about three pillars of environmental, economic, and social sustainability. But what does it really mean to sustain these things? What does that look like? There's a lot of people who've kind of question that and challenge what it means. There's an economist, Kate Raworth, who's talked about sustainability as being about finding the safe and just space for humanity where people's needs are met without exceeding the ecological limits of our planet. But thinking outside of the Western kind of mindset, there's a lot of inspiration we can draw from other worldviews and other perspectives. The seventh generation principle that some of you might be familiar with is a Haudenosaunee philosophy that suggests that when we make decisions today, we should take into consideration the impacts they're going to have 7 generations into the future. And this remains a really important idea that grounds our thinking and our planning around sustainability. Is how do we think about the needs and the lives of future generations when we think about what we teach and what we do today. Across all of these, I think one of the key things is that sustainability is tied to engaging with what we sometimes call deep leverage points of change. These kinds of changes that we need to make to our society that are connected to our values, to our worldviews, to what's normal around us. And so when we think about teaching, it's really about changing our beliefs, our values, and confronting those with our students.
And maybe I'll just add to that from an education perspective. We find that it's really important to be talking about sustainability in education because it's a topic that students are already thinking about. There's a lot of research coming out about the anxiety and other related eco-emotions that students and quite honestly, faculty members are feeling about the state of the world right now. But when we look at how education approaches sustainability, it's often reserved to science courses. And so that sort of influences the way we think about sustainability and potential solutions. But when we look at the causes of unsustainability, those are often not scientific problems, but social, political, economic issues. And so we need to be talking about sustainability from all those different perspectives and solutions from all those different perspectives, not just scientific or technological perspectives. And so we think that sustainability education needs to go beyond just information-based approaches to learning. We have a lot of information already that hasn't necessarily changed our behaviors. So we need to take a more holistic approach, which includes cognitive learning and learning information and expanding our knowledge base, but also taking a more affective or socio-emotional learning perspective, more psychomotor or action-based learning approach that empowers students to take action about what they're learning about. We often refer to this as like a head, hands, heart approach. So you're gaining information, you're developing a passion and care for the issues that are happening, and you're also learning how to take action.
The head, hand, heart it's almost a mnemonic we can use, like the 3H approach. I can really imagine that would be helpful when working with our students, giving them sort of that aid to keep these things in mind as we consider sustainability. I'd like to pick up on some of the things that you said. You're talking about this holistic approach, and I think, I'm going to mention that Teaching and Learning Services has a blog. It's called the Teaching for Learning blog at McGill. And in that blog, we've published a series of posts that describe courses where facets of sustainability have been integrated. And some of the courses or the topics might seem less obvious, like equity in a music course and ethics in an engineering course. This feels like that holistic approach that you were talking about. Could you go a little bit more in depth about some of those examples and how we can understand the different pillars of sustainability sort of beyond the environment, because that's fairly well known?
I think there's a slogan that we often hear in protests or in social action around the climate crisis and other things, which is that to change everything, we need everyone. And I find it's actually a powerful slogan in terms of thinking hard about who's included in the conversations about the kind of world we want to see, the kind of changes we feel are needed in our world. And we know that there are, in the environmental movements and in a lot of sustainability movements, there's a tendency to not always have space for everyone. There's a lot of voices that aren't often heard, and this is a problem. And so this matters not only in terms of the kinds of disciplines that are being involved. Is it just, as Stephanie mentioned, sort of science-based professionals or students? Or are we engaging with people who are thinking about ethics, thinking about the arts, thinking about our health and our overall well-being? And our argument is that we actually need all of those worldviews and all those kinds of perspectives to come up with lasting and transformative responses. But another thing to think about is that entire groups of people and entire populations of people who've really been excluded from the mainstream conversations about sustainability. These are people, for example, largely living in the global south, who have had probably the least to do with the impacts that we're currently experiencing, but also people who've been marginalized on the basis of age, gender, race, and orientation, and all other sorts of other forms of exclusion. And increasingly, when we think about social sustainability, we think about the need to create spaces that are inclusive to these diverse sets of populations and to understand their views, their experiences, and their ideas for the future. This is a big challenge for educators. Instructors are often facing kind of a challenge of addressing multiple competing priorities when they're thinking about a course design. They want to talk about decolonization. They want to talk about EDI. They want to talk about things like sustainability. And it feels like a lot to take on. And we think taking this kind of holistic or intersectional view on sustainability actually can be a really important tool to help us see the connections between people who've been historically marginalized on the basis of sexual orientation or gender or ethnicity, and our desire to come up with responses that are inclusive of a whole range of perspectives. Or similarly, people who are working in fields that on the surface don't look like they have a lot to do with sustainability, who might have ideas that are really inspiring and deeply thought-provoking about ways we can rethink our economies, our social foundations, our ways of engaging with the environment, and more. So taking this holistic approach to sustainability really means kind of trying to build the connections between these diverse groups, these different perspectives and disciplines within our courses and on our campus.
I think that's really helpful for helping us understand a little bit better why it's important to involve everybody. Stephanie, did you want to add anything to that?
I think just to say that, Blane mentioned that these more marginalized populations are often the ones who contributed the least to the problems that we're seeing today, but at the same time are often the ones who are most affected by things like climate change and biodiversity loss. And so it's really essential to be incorporating them into our conversations about how we learn about this issue and also how we can address it.
And one of those conversations, of course, can come through what we build into the design of our courses.
Right.
Thank you so much for both of your thoughtful responses. I appreciate the response to this question and the well-known slogan, to change everything, we need everyone. I feel like it can also sort of mean to change everything, it needs to be for everyone too. So that's something important to keep in mind. And including diverse perspectives and having this shared responsibility is crucial here. And as we said, this does very directly relate to course design and how all subjects and all faculties should be involved in the conversation of sustainability. As you said earlier, Stephanie, it needs to move beyond just science courses. And that seems to be the most obvious discipline, but it's really interesting to see these other disciplines getting involved. And I'm excited to look more into that, into the examples that we'll be looking at in further episodes. Now, in the McGill context, we have had a Sustainability Education Fellows or SEF program where instructors and students were paired to design or redesign courses. Could you walk us through why it was necessary to design a program like this to support sustainability in course design, Stephanie?
Sure. So before the SEF program started, Blane and I and other colleagues had done some research about the context at McGill and found that there are many sustainability players across campus who are interested in sustainability, who are taking action, who are already incorporating sustainability into their coursework, but they were really working in isolation. And so the SEF program was an opportunity to create a space where we could bring these different players together and bring our minds into one space and take that intersectional approach to sustainability. And so, as you said, we bring together both faculty members and students to learn about sustainability education and ways that they can sort of provide them with a toolbox that they can use to redesign or design a new course that places sustainability at the core. And so it's I think probably the easiest approach to incorporate sustainability into coursework is to add on additional content. And what we do in this interdisciplinary space, because we are not content experts in all these different areas. I'm not an engineer. I am not a scientist. I don't have the content that is necessary for each of these courses. But when we start talking about sustainability competencies like systems thinking and futures thinking about some of the worldviews that Blane mentioned, thinking about the values that we bring into the classroom, then we create this really rich space where we can start understanding the issues from different perspectives, and we can have these deeper conversations about how do we approach sustainability in a different way. So when we have people from literature and from agriculture and from education and music all thinking together, we learn about the issue from conceptual perspectives and different conceptual levels, but also at pedagogical levels. And we learn what are the norms of practice in music that might be different from engineering. What does a classroom look like? How do we value learning? What does learning look like in these different spaces? And how do we support each other in incorporating these different pedagogical approaches to sustainability learning?
That notion of interdisciplinarity or having conversations with people from different disciplines to design courses is something that we really try to promote. Peer-to-peer learning is very powerful. So having instructors talk to other instructors about how they approach teaching can be very, very enriching.
Yes, and we're just starting to conduct a more formal study on the program and some of the takeaways for faculty and student participants. And the thing that's really showing up in the responses is the importance of that interdisciplinary cohort and what they've learned from having those conversations and learning that they're not working in isolation, but really just completely opening their perspectives and understanding of what is sustainability, how is it defined, and what does it mean to learn about that issue.
Teaching is often done in isolation, and it's really good if we can, change that and make it more of be in a situation where instructors are more comfortable talking about what goes on in their classroom and moving away from pedagogical isolation.
Maybe I can add on just our view that it's not only within peers, and I think the peer-to-peer is so powerful and so important, and is essential for encouraging people who are stuck in something that they may feel they're the only ones in their specific subgroup that's investing time into it, or they're feeling that they're not sure if it's valued within their own kind of department as much as it ought to be, but also with the wider campus. So understanding how they can draw resources from the Office of Sustainability, from the library. We often have, conversations that engage other parts of the campus to understand what the opportunities for course redesign are, what resources instructors can draw upon. And I think this is a really important thing for rethinking courses deeply, is understanding the ways we can break out of our established patterns and what resources we can turn to help us do that. So whether that's using outdoor spaces, for instance, or using forms of assessment or forms of content sharing that are unusual for the discipline that we're used to working in. So these are really important things that we can learn from our peers, but also from elsewhere on the campus, and can be really helpful for inspiring us to think deeply about how we can transform our teaching practices.
Well, I think it would be helpful to maybe get into a few brief examples of what we're talking about here. So Stephanie and Blane, you have both been working with instructors in the SEF program to help build sustainability into their courses. Can you tell us about the approach that you've taken and provide some examples of the pedagogical changes, whether they were big or small, that instructors have built into their courses?
Sure, I'll start, and I think Stephanie can chime in with some specific examples that build on that. So, in terms of the approach that we've taken, we've kind of used the metaphor of an iceberg. That at the bottom of an iceberg, that's what's often invisible is the sort of values that we hold, the norms that we're used to working with, the worldview that we operate from. And often when we think about our courses, we don't really interrogate that very extensively, but we in the course have tried to encourage people to be more transparent, to be more aware of those things and how they shape what happens in their classroom. But obviously at the top of the iceberg, the thing that we see quite evidently and that our students see are the curriculum content that we use, the forms of assessment that we use, the pedagogical approaches that we use when we're in our classroom time. And so we encourage people to think about those as well and to engage, as we were just talking about, in some sharing and peer-to-peer learning. Now, a lot of the practices that we will probably discuss here and in future episodes, they're not unique to sustainability education. Really, they're rooted in what we feel are key practices for helping learners broaden their understandings of and connect with and feel motivated and confident to act upon in real life. So that head, hand, and heart kind of perspective. We know that there are particular practices that are especially powerful for building that sense of connectedness, that sense of confidence to act, and this awareness of the importance of particular issues. So when we've been thinking about the practices, we've been inviting people to look at their curriculum, their assessment, and their pedagogies. When we've been thinking about the norms that exist within our particular department, we've been inviting the instructors to think about the learning outcomes and the competencies and how those are important and can be leveraged. And lastly, when we think about the values, really it's been more about kind of more critical and questioning orientations to the purpose and the content of their course. And maybe Stephanie, you can speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So Blane talked about this iceberg metaphor that we use to talk about sort of different entry points for course redesign or course design. And we spend time going through these different layers of the iceberg, and we find that students and faculty members sort of latch onto different parts of the iceberg and use those as areas for very conscious redesign. And so one example would be, from a curriculum perspective, which we consider the tip of the iceberg, most of the participants do an analysis of their reading lists. What are the voices that are included on the reading list, and what perspectives am I bringing into this course? Many of them rethink their pedagogical approaches, and we see in the course outlines that are resubmitted at the end of the fellowship, many of the faculty members are including more like examples of real world learning, actually leaving the classroom using real world case studies as the basis for their course content that they're building around. We see that in their assessment practices, many faculty members are taking that head, hands, heart approach, and they're thinking about affective learning and building more positionality statements into the assignments. They're also thinking about what are the implications of the work that we're doing. So not just do you have a conceptual understanding, can you complete the problem sets from this course, but are you aware of the implications of the work or of the design that you are proposing? What are the human and planetary implications of the work that you are proposing? And then some of the faculty members are even including like values statements or their own positionality statements directly on the course outline to sort of move away from this idea that instructors are neutral and that they bring a neutral perspective to the course content. Many of them are being very explicit about the perspective that they're bringing. Not that it's the only perspective, but saying this is kind of our starting point. This is how the course is being framed, and encouraging students to also be very clear about the positionalities and perspectives that they're bringing to the class.
You have raised so many interesting points and so many things that would be worthwhile talking more about. And I really look forward to seeing how these ideas play out in some examples when we get into our later episodes. I mean, we've talked about why building facets of sustainability into our courses matters, as well as the value of a holistic approach or an approach across disciplines. So we've heard so many interesting ideas, but before we close the podcast, is there anything else that you'd like to share with us? Any final thoughts or any advice for listeners?
I think I'll just add that, Blane said that we talk about sustainability pedagogies in the SEF program. And Blane mentioned that these are just good educational practices for teaching and learning. And so when you pair these really sound pedagogical approaches with the purpose of sustainability and making the planet better, it's really, I think, a profound experience for instructors and for students to move into this direction of learning, because it feels purposeful, it feels impactful, and they also feel like they are equipped and empowered to take action in the real world.
Maybe I'll just close by highlighting one other part of the conversation that we've been having today that has been really important over the last couple of years of us working on this, which has been the power of community. And whether that's between the students forming community in our classrooms, the instructors forming community through initiatives like the SEF and elsewhere on campus, the power of that community building to inspire us to act, to convince us of the power of our own actions, and to give us new ideas on ways forward is just can't be understated. So I think if this seems daunting or if this seems challenging, connecting with others and learning together really is the best way forward. So hopefully that stands out.
We're going to end on that very powerful note. Thank you so much to Blane and Stephanie for joining us today and not only sharing your expertise, but your enthusiasm for this topic. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. And a reminder to please subscribe to Teach, Learn, Share and share the link with others. Until next time.